everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Hangar Bay. And we're going to go with aircraft that was basically a prototype, and from the intro you probably saw, it never really made a big impact, and there was only 3 of them built, and you can see the variations in the pictures before you. But basically, the whole point of this first episode is to go over what the YB-49 or also the XB-35 and XB-36, what plane was it, and why did it fail? And here we have the historical board gaming versions of this particular plane. Ever since I saw it first advertised on historical board gaming, I absolutely fell in love with it. And I took some liberties with painting it up and also decaling it up, and I think it actually looks pretty sharp here. So these two particular planes are painted with a gold paint as well as a silver main paint, and then of course I used historical board gaming's decals that you can get on historical board gaming to just give it that extra look. Now, one thing you can see here in some of the pictures, especially this one here, you have the Air Force Randall or decal on the left side of the wing, and also on here too. And that was very common for a lot of US Air Force planes. They didn't usually have 2 on either side. But I know with a lot of German planes, Japanese planes, especially during the Second World War and many others, they actually had lots of them, on both sides of the wings. And consequently, because of that, I want to keep some symmetrical looks. I just think it looks better than actually just having that. So that's one thing where I variate from the historical board gaming, from the historical aspect of these planes. Now, there was only 3 prototypes built. To go back into the history of these planes, it's probably best to tell why these were developed. In 1938, the Germans were starting to develop the America bomber, the concept of basically being able to bomb America from Europe. And ultimately, that never really saw into fruition, but basically the Americans had to come up with an idea. Had Britain fell, what would be the options for bombing Europe from the United States, or the continental United States? So they came up with this prototype, which was the XB-35. And this particular sculpt is actually their propeller-driven version. As you can see here, right here, it's actually a very, very good impression, just obviously without the impellers. It was known as the Flying Wing, as I'm sure some of you know from the Indiana Jones movies. We see a few flying wing concepts, but they never really saw fruition because they were ahead of their time. Now you may relate to the B-2 bomber, especially with the American Air Force, but one thing with this, it was ahead of its time. And unfortunately, just the technology wasn't there to see it into a huge success. So they made the XB-35 and the XB-36, which were propeller-driven aircraft. But then they were converted later on into the YB-49, which is actually technically the name on historical board gaming, but these sculpts technically are the earlier version, the prop version of them, which, my personal opinion, I love. I think they're just beautiful, and I've kind of added them to my Global War 1936 game as a potential heavy bomber, or potentially a futuristic bomber with expansions, or any other game that would bring the game into the late 40s, even perhaps early 50s. Now, one inspiration was the Horten 29. That was a German fighter bomber interceptor that was developed by the Horten brothers, and of course it never ever really saw fruition. There was a few prototypes built, and of course the Horten 18, which was a flying wing, which we'll probably cover in a future Hangar Bay episode. But basically, they never saw production either because the war for Germany ended too soon. And realistically, Northrop Grumman, or Northrop at the time, which designed the plane, actually Jack Northrop himself, was up against Consolidated and Boeing. But the B-36 was really its big rival at that time, and of course it could carry a heavier bomb load than this, but of course I think a lot of the Air Force officials really loved the design and style, and was granted, I believe, a 35 production assembly competition of it. So and then of course consequently thereafter it ran into a lot of issues. This particular plane has a crew of, or can carry a crew of 7, but usually I think about a crew of 3 was all which was necessary. The design itself is basically a flying wing. The beautiful thing about it, it's no rudder, no stabilizer, and no parasitic drag or weight. And that was the cool thing about these particular planes. The first test flight was in June 1946 with the XB-35, and of course that's when they won their competition for 35 planes, which never really saw a full fruition. The plane ended up having a lot of vibration issues, and of course consequently it was grounded, but then was quickly converted, and you can see here in some of these images is the jet version of it, which eventually became the YB-49. And it was a beautiful prototype, but the problem with them, it was basically classified as a medium bomber, and that was the downfall with the YB-49. It just didn't have the bomb load it could carry with the B-36 or future bombers for that matter. And once again, we were still in the prototype phase, and this was approaching the late 40s, and consequently it could carry maybe 132,000 pounds of bombs, but it couldn't carry really no nuclear payload at the time. So consequently, that's why it never really survived into the future, into the 50s or 60s, in any great image. And in 1948, it suffered its first crash with the prototype, and consequently, the crew never returned. But in 1950, another crash happened, and basically it had a nose wheel collapse. And then 2 more years of testing went on, but basically the project collapsed in 1953, and this beautiful plane that I would love to have seen flying over the skies never really happened. But however, it does live on in the B-2 because ironically it actually has the same wing profile. So even though it probably doesn't share a name or the same contractor who built it, the B-2 is probably the closest relative existing today of this early version. And the sad truth is it just truly was ahead of its time. But it's also a great addition to your historical board gaming buy, if that's something you want to do, or your Global War 36 game, if you want to add that as a futuristic heavy bomber. Definitely, by all means, consider this, because this was a prototype, but was designed, or early stages of designing, was in the Second World War. If Britain ever fell, what would the Americans do to help liberate or cause enough destruction to the German war machine that would help turn the war in their favor? So hopefully you guys enjoyed this first episode. This is basically just covering over the YB-49 and also the XB-35 and XB-36 early prototypes. And hopefully you appreciate now this plane in history. And I wish it could have seen a little bit more, but of course, as history is, it is always that to the fates. So anyways, guys, take care, and hopefully we'll see you again for the next episode of the Hangar Bay. You guys all stay classy, and we will see you guys later.